In today's video, I've actually collected all the comments and DMs and questions I've actually have around charging, or rather the myths around charging. I've researched the topic as much as possible, and a lot of things that I'll be sharing today, it's part research and also part stuff that I'm already doing. So let's get straight into it. Hi folks, welcome back to the channel. So in case we haven't met, my name is Charles, and on this channel, we try very hard to kind of do content around maximizing the capabilities of your C-Line 7 or BYDs for that matter, because a lot of the features overlap, and occasionally I'll sprinkle in some gadget reviews as well. So like mentioned earlier, today we are specifically diving into EV charging myth/questions. So let's get straight into it. The first question that I always get asked is the ability for EV batteries to be charged to 100%. It's funny because I feel that this issue, the person that is part to be blamed for it is also the car vendors themselves, because they are always very vague about the ability to charge 100%. But from what I understand, like for example the BYDs, because they use LFP batteries, there's no issues for them to be charged to 100%. In fact, it actually benefits the battery to be occasionally charged to 100%. This is for cell balancing, etc., etc. Because the LFP batteries are pretty stable in voltage. So if you don't actually charge it often to 100%, it doesn't realign, recalibrate itself well. So as for me, I actually charge to 100% pretty often. In fact, I charge to 100% every week, or if I miss a week, probably every 2 weeks. So riding with this myth is also the second myth around charging the battery only to 80%. Again, riding on the first myth, the second myth is a bit busted if you actually know the battery chemistry of your particular car. But the other upside of charging 80% generally is a rule, or rather a recommendation, is because as you go beyond 80%, the battery actually slows down the charge to kind of fill the battery. Instead of between like say 20 to 80%, you get full voltage and you charge really fast. But as it hits 80%, it slows down quite drastically, and you kind of wait at the charging point for longer than expected. So typically on highways, charge to 80%, get to your next stop, top it up to 80% again. So in that way, you don't waste too much time at the charger. The next myth is around DC chargers. Using DC chargers often on your car actually destroys your car. You know what? If this is actually true, this should be like the first line in every single car manual. So I can tell you where this myth actually comes from. So historically, what happens is that the older versions of EVs like the Nissan Leaf didn't have proper cooling when the car is charging. So with DC charging, obviously introducing a lot of power into the battery generates a lot of heat, and heat, as we know, degrades batteries over time. So with the newer models of the car, I'm not too sure if you have charged your car recently, if you put DC in your car, even if your car is switched off, before long you can hear the fans kind of running at full speed trying to cool the battery. So with modern cars, the heat issue is a non-existential issue. So it's a myth that DC charging actually destroys your battery over the long run. The next one is a bit of an odd one. I caught this recently in a comment where somebody was asking, I heard the myth where when you charge your car, you can't actually lock your car. I was like, well, that's an odd one. I have actually, plugged in my charger, locked it, and go for shopping or supermarketing and came back to the car. I don't actually know where this comes from. Again, it may vary from car to car, but it's just seemed a bit odd if any cars, in the market doesn't allow you to lock the car while you charge. So when you charge the car, you cannot actually sit inside the car. This is an interesting one because I don't actually know where this myth comes from as well. Is it because of radiation, or is it just you're afraid of the car catching fire, or what is it? Or you can't lock the door, whatever the reason may be. But the truth of it is that there's no such thing. I sit in the car all the time while charging if I need to in a public charger, or even at home if I want to do something in the car, just plug it in. So staying in the car while charging, myth. You always have to wait for a charger to be available. So you know what? It's unlike going to a petrol station where you just pump petrol immediately. Recently, I did a short and I visited a whole bunch of petrol kiosks or charging points. No queues at all. Or rather, whenever there's a queue, it's probably like 5 chargers. You probably have one or 2 guns being used, and the rest of the guns are empty. So I don't actually know if this is true. Even if it is, within a 5-kilometer radius, they typically nowadays in Singapore and most major cities, there's plenty of chargers around anyhow. Not to mention, a lot of people that say this don't actually realize that you don't actually need to charge to full all the time. You can charge, 10-15 minutes, you probably get about 80% like we discussed earlier, and you're pretty much good for 200-300 kilometers. The next one is my favorite. A lot of haters leave this on my comments about EVs catching fire. And how timely. And it's unfortunate in recent time, and just last week itself, 2 cars in Singapore caught fire and made the news. And interestingly enough, guess what? It wasn't EVs, it was ICE cars. What a lot of people don't realize is that actually ICE cars have a higher chance of getting into fires. So just to give you a bit of metrics, some of the recent surveys in the US actually shows that for every 100,000 EVs, 25 catches fire. And guess what? 100,000 ICE cars, 1,000 catches fire. So the chance of a, ICE car spontaneously combusting, definitely way higher than the one that's on the EV. But of course, like all things, when EV catches fire, it always makes the news because it's actually more spectacular. The next one I occasionally get is, how about running your battery to zero? Running your battery to zero would destroy it or degrade it. Well, let's just say in EVs, the battery, when it shows zero, it's actually not true zero. Typically, when it's zero, there's actually a buffer as well. So you can actually never really run it dry. And a lot of time, the battery management system takes care of a lot of this stuff. So there's very little to worry about, to be really honest. Having said that, occasionally running it to zero is not a big deal. Just try not to do it very often. And I don't actually think a lot of us will run, the batteries to zero all the time anyway. Much like how we drive ICE cars. We don't drive, until the car stops and completely runs dry. So why would we do it with an EV? EV charging is going to be more expensive than petrol over the long time due to road tax, etc. Well, this is an interesting one. I mean, if you're kind of just outright doing the calculation, there is no way that the EV charging cost is more expensive than petrol. But unfortunately, the component of EV cost due to road tax is something that we can't control and we can't actually kind of predict anyway. So for example, in Singapore, there's another additional $700 EV charge to the road tax compared to a traditional ICE car. But there's also a lot of rumors in Australia that there is additional tax coming for EVs. But again, I would say this is plausible. I'm not sure how the government and policies could impact this, but today, as it stands, for most countries, EVs still come out a little bit more economical. So the next one is about EV batteries going to landfills. What's going to happen to the EV when you decommission the car or the car goes to scrap? All this will create additional pollution, etc. So what a lot of people don't actually realize is that 95% of EV batteries are actually recycled. And the big boys like Kettle are already starting to do and upscale their recycling practices to make sure that this isn't an issue moving forward. If you compare this with petrol, if you burn petrol, it creates a whole bunch of pollution, but where's the petrol? Gone forever. So yeah, I'm not too sure about this argument point. I can only comment from the research and what I've read. It's anybody's guess what's going to happen in the future, but it's good to know that there's effort to recycle this. The next one that I get in my comments is that, you can't actually charge your car in the rain. So I can kind of guess where this myth comes about. Obviously, water and electricity don't play well in most cases. But thankfully, a lot of the charging ports on cars and as well as providers are already IP67 waterproof rated. They've obviously thought about this. And I'm not too sure if you realize when you plug in your gun to the car, it does a bit of negotiation. As part of the negotiation process, it also makes sure things like ground is all connected and there is no short circuiting. So assuming there's water detected and it short circuits, the car doesn't charge. So those are some of the protective mechanisms that are built into the car to make sure that water isn't an issue and you can actually do it in the rain. So something to think about. I'm not too sure if you realize there are also chargers that are outdoors, like Tesla chargers and some public chargers in Singapore. If you can't actually have charging in the rain, why would anybody put a public charger outside? Yeah, food for thought. The next one I have on my list is leaving your EV plugged in charging overnight is bad idea. It's very dangerous. I think this comes from the misunderstanding of how charging actually works in EVs. So it might be a case where people think that, hey, if you have a hose connected to a pipe and you plug it, there's always pressure built upon that particular pipe and it's always pushing against that plug. Unfortunately, in EVs, or rather fortunately in EVs, that is not how it works. So what happens is that it's a combination of the battery management system, which is the BMS in the car, and also the charging point. Both have to communicate in such a way that the BMS system says, hey, I want to receive power, and power gets sent. Otherwise, there is no power. The power is completely cut. So in your case, if you plug it in overnight and it charges to 100%, it actually stops. So there's no power flow on the cable itself. So there is no risk of it catching fire, etc., etc. Another cool experiment here is that if you look at your phones and your laptop devices, if you plug it overnight and leave it charging, does it catch on fire? If the laptops and mobile phones can have a proper BMS system, do you not think a car with a massive battery not have a BMS system? Next myth around discharging and charging. There is a myth that talks about, oh, you all have to kind of frequently discharge the car to 0 and charge it up back to 100%. Yeah, that's not quite true. That used to apply for nickel cadmium or NiCad batteries because you kind of want to keep that memory of the battery. But like I mentioned much earlier, the occasional charging to 100% is more than sufficient to kind of build that memory for the LFP batteries. But otherwise, there is really no need to discharge your car completely. This has to do a lot with also the advancement in modern BMS systems to kind of auto level the battery cells. So the next one is going to be a funny one. I actually got this in a DM and it says like, hey, you know what? You shouldn't use public chargers because once you plug it in your car, they can actually steal data from your car and also control your car or remotely control your car. Just be very clear. When you plug in your car in the public charger, all that's coming through the wires is actually power. There is not data, nothing of whatsoever. It is not a USB port, so you can be rest assured nothing of that sort actually happens. I think the only thing that happens that you might be a bit concerned about is the billing, right? And that's when they want to bill you for how much electricity you have actually taken from the charger, and yeah, you tap your credit card against it. And a lot of times these days, you don't actually even tap your credit card against the charger. You just scan a QR code and the app actually communicates to the backend and charges accordingly. This comes up relatively often as well, that EV batteries only last for a few years. Well, if you look at a lot of the car manufacturers, they typically warranty their battery between 8 to 10 years. And a lot of older Teslas that actually people have seen on the road, and when they ask their owners what is the degradation like, a lot of them say, it still hold 85 to 90% charge. So yeah, it's actually not true that it completely destroys after a couple of years. And even after 10 years and over 100,000 miles or something crazy like that, it still holds a relatively decent charge. For most of us who have bought the EVs in the last year or two, yeah, you have at least 8 to 10 years to use it and it's covered under warranty. So there's really little to be concerned about. An EV battery potentially costs more than the car itself to replace. Well, you know what? There used to be some truth in this because in early days of EVs, batteries are very expensive. And it's about a rough figure of $1,000 to a kilowatt of hour battery. And recently it's down to about $100 per kilowatt of battery. And the good thing about batteries is when there's damaged batteries, they don't typically replace the entire battery. So they only replace the damaged cells. Yeah, it's not really true that the cost of swapping out the entire battery costs more than the car itself. At least not today. And as the technology matures, much like everything in technology, it's a game of scale. The more people have it, the more readily available it is, the cheaper it gets. So yeah, it's just a matter of time it actually gets lower. So if this video is interesting and useful for you, you might also want to check out this video up here where I talk about the risk of staying in the car while the car is charging. And as always, thanks again for tuning in and I'll see you guys in the next one.